Well, while Twitter does have the right to decide how they want to moderate their content and how they want to navigate our civil liberties, Congress should not have the right to negotiate that. But appears that the Fourth Amendment is yet again on the table. There are two competing bills going on right now, both brought forward by Republicans, but they are competing from different factions, looking at reforming Section 702 of FISA. I want to roll this clip to get us started from Senator Mike Lee, who is a privacy proponent. And this is an interview he did with Glenn Greenwald recently discussing the bad bill that's on the table. And then we'll parse through the differences in the other one that is under consideration.
Okay, so the House Intelligence Committee bill, the HIPSI, as we call that committee, is doubly bad. Number one, it extends out the authorization period for FISA 702 by 9 years. To my knowledge, we've never had an authorization for FISA that long. Number two, it does so without any generally applicable warrant requirement. It purports to have a warrant requirement for a narrow subset of backdoor searches on American citizens, but they've written it in such a way that it would have practically zero effect. It wouldn't really have any practical effect because they can always get around this very narrow type of search where it's focused exclusively on evidence of a crime with nothing having to do with an actual national security investigation. But it's so much worse than that. The third big problem with the HIPSI bill, and this is the granddaddy of them all, is found in Section 504 of the HIPSI bill. In Section 504, this would vastly magnify the domestic surveillance capability and the ability of our intelligence gathering agencies to collect warrantless surveillance on American citizens without probable cause in the United States by expanding the reach of 702 into things like public Wi-Fi's at hotels, restaurants, coffee shops, bookstores, anything like that. All of a sudden, the intelligence gathering agencies could go to those entities that offer public Wi-Fi service, demand without a warrant all the data that crossed through those public Wi-Fi stations. And they could do that without ever going to court, without ever having to demonstrate probable cause or otherwise going through the steps of acquiring a warrant. This is bad. They're claiming that they're fixing the problem, and they're actually making the problem worse. And this is appalling. This is why this bill is something I've been describing as a Trojan horse, appropriately so, and it needs to be dismissed as such.
So, Brad, just to de-densify the subject matters, I know it can get into the weeds pretty quickly. I want to reiterate that the bad bill is being put forth by the House Intelligence Committee. And as Senator Mike Lee said, they are claiming that this is to reform Section 702 of FISA, which most people have come to hate. But in reality, it's an expansion of that provision. So it was actually scheduled for a floor vote today, which is Tuesday, but it has ended up being punted because Republicans could not agree on which bill, this one or the House Judiciary bill that's competing with it, should move forward. So I'm going to get to the good bill in a minute, but this isn't going away. People need to be on guard. It's probably coming back in the next couple of weeks, maybe even sooner. So if you're concerned about this, you do need to be contacting your House representatives because I think this is Mayday. Other people like Edward Snowden, Elizabeth Goyton from the Brennan Center, Glenn Greenwald, they're calling this the largest expansion of the surveillance state inside the United States since the Patriot Act. They're basically saying that in this bill, it's a seemingly innocuous change to the definition of electronic service communications providers. What that does is the bill actually vastly expands the universe of U.S. businesses that can be conscripted to aid the government in conducting surveillance. And Elizabeth Goyton, who's with the Brennan Center again, she said under current law, the government can compel companies that have direct access to communications, such as phone, email, or text messaging service providers, to assist in Section 702 surveillance by turning over the communications. But under this new provision, which is Section 504 of the House Intelligence Committee's bill, any entity that has access to, quote, quote, equipment on which communications may be transmitted or stored, such as an ordinary router, is fair game. What does that mean in practice? It's simple. Hotels, libraries, coffee shops, And other places that offer Wi-Fi to their customers could be forced to serve as surrogate spies. They could be required to configure their systems to ensure that they can provide the government access to entire streams of communication. Even a repair person who comes to fix the Wi-Fi in your home would meet the revised definition. That person is an employee of a service provider who has access to equipment, your router, on which communications are transmitted. While the bill's sponsors deny that Section 504 is intended to sweep so broadly, what is the provision intended to do and how is the government planning to use it is the main point we should be asking. At the end of the day, though, the government's claimed intent matters very little. What matters is what the provision on its face actually allows, because as we all know by now, the government will interpret and apply the law as broadly as it can get away with. And she goes on to note that one of the FISA court amici actually posted a blog to warn Americans about this provision. She said, "I can't overstate how unusual it is for FISA court amici to take to the airwaves in this manner." So there's multiple people, even unusual allies, who are ringing the alarm about this. So I'll toss it to you for your thoughts before we get into the competing bill.
Yeah, it's just disturbing because FISA, right, the Foreign Intelligence Services Act, is supposed to be about spying on foreigners, not on Americans. But from its inception, it has been used to spy on Americans, as we've seen, including even members of the Trump campaign. But so this is something we see in privacy a lot, the matter of privacy law and what the government does, this third-party issue. Because if the government wanted to search your home, they have to get a warrant and show probable cause. But there's this third-party doctrine that if you're, it's a phone company or someone else is holding your data, they can search it without a warrant if the company agrees to it. And so it sounds like they're trying to put that on steroids and say that, oh, well, the government can't come search your phone, but we can ask Starbucks for your data without a warrant and get it from them to see everywhere you went on the internet. It's like, all right, so we're basically just doing an end round around the Fourth Amendment, around the whole idea of probable cause and getting a warrant before searching. So it's like I would respect them more if they just openly were arguing, we need to abolish the Fourth Amendment. You shouldn't have to get a warrant. We just need to be able to search people whenever we want. But instead, they're doing this really pernicious thing, at least it seems to me, where they're trying to pretend that they're keeping the protections for civil liberties in place while actually creating even more workarounds so that they can violate them and effectively render them non-existent while they remain on paper, which seems to me exponentially more sinister than even just infringing people's rights and being upfront about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we already know, thanks to Snowden's revelations and whistleblowing a number of years ago, that they are spying on Americans en masse. They are collecting a crazy amount of data on us, and yet it's not enough, right? We already have the world's largest prison population. We already convict thousands of people wrongfully, but that's not good enough. They need to go even further in spying on people and trying to get evidence that they can use against you in court. This is insanity. This is major police state territory. I think it's really concerning. According to reporting by The Intercept, they say that the Intelligence Committee's bill is being quietly supported by the White House and, shocker, senior intelligence community officials. They go on to say the House Judiciary Committee, meanwhile, free from the influence wielded by spy agencies over the Intelligence Committee, has advanced a competing piece of legislation which would defang the 702 authority by forcing government officials to obtain warrants, how novel, prior to its use. In addition to a number of other reforms that would inhibit warrantless data collection, in Congress, the bill is supported by members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus as well as the right-wing Freedom Caucus, which I just think is so interesting. Anytime you see those two caucuses joining forces, it's probably the right thing to do when it comes to civil liberties. They also say that the House Judiciary Committee's competing bill is also backed by the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the ACLU. And so it's called the Protect Liberty Act. It would actually make real reforms to FISA Section 702 to better protect Americans, to make sure that warrants were required. It would not have this gigantic expansion of the kinds of equipment that can be surveilled. So that's definitely the one that I would advocate for. As I mentioned, this basically got punted, and it's going to be coming up down the road because the Republicans were essentially fighting over which pathway they wanted to take. According to the New York Times, the House scrapped votes on rival bills late Monday. that would narrow the scope of a powerful surveillance tool after an ugly fight broke out among Republicans, likely punting until next year on plans to renew, but also limiting an expiring wiretapping law at the heart of the program. In a hastily organized closed-door meeting, Republican members traded accusations and even expletives as they argued over which of the two measures to overhaul the law, known as Section 702, should be put to the floor. Under the law, the government can conduct warrantless surveillance of foreigners abroad, but also sometimes sweeps in Americans' private messages. I love that they put sometimes because we're talking about in the millions. The dispute effectively upended Speaker Mike Johnson's plans to have the House vote on both measures this week and send to the Senate whichever one secured a larger majority, a rare move that conservatives vigorously protested. And I love this quote from Thomas Massey. He says, "I've never seen us bring multiple bills at the same time from different committees and put them on the floor and have a beauty pageant." So they couldn't get on the same page about what to do. So it is getting punted down the road. So yeah, that's basically where we're at. But Brad, I think this is really concerning. Per usual, we see the intelligence community and other proponents of, a large government basically saying we have to do this in order to stop terrorists. And I just don't think that tracks whatsoever. The more recent examples I can think of how they've used this is to spy on the Trump campaign wrongfully, spy on Black Lives Matter protesters, spy on January 6th protesters, political donors. I mean, this has been one of the most abused provisions out there.
Yeah, and a lot of the surveillance powers they added under the Patriot Act ended up being used for the drug war. So it's not really, I mean, they always say that national security. If it's really national security at stake, it really shouldn't be that hard to get a warrant. Like, probable cause is not that high a bar to meet. And we can't just give up our liberties in the name of safety and security every time, because that's always what they say. In the United States, I mean, while terrorism is always a threat, the actual amount of lives lost to terrorists since 9/11 is incredibly minuscule. And we already have expansive power. So yeah, I just don't really buy that they need to be able to search Starbucks, Wi-Fi browsing history, what everybody's been looking up, or we're going to have another 9/11 style event. I mean, that's what they say about everything. I don't really find it particularly credible. And it's not like we're even the reform bill you discussed, which sounds pretty sensible to me. It's not like it's taking away their surveillance powers. Just got to get a warrant. And a warrant is not a high bar to get. You just got to have some proof that there's a reason you're looking into this person. And if you don't have that, why are you looking into the person? Why are you trying to search them? I mean, it doesn't seem crazy to me. It really, really doesn't, to just expect the government to get a warrant and to not be able to do all these legal loopholes to backdoor search people all the time without even showing the most basic threshold of why it's necessary.
Well, and what's crazy is that, like you mentioned, they claim that they need this to spy on potential terrorists, right? To spy on foreigners, and that if it happens to catch up Americans in those discussions, like, they're not going to target them. That's not part of it, blah, 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 blah. Then why is it so hard for you to get a warrant to go after Americans, right? Like, there's no actual logical progression there that makes any sense. If you're not using this to wrongfully spy on and target Americans, then having to get a warrant would not be a big deal. And yet we see them fighting tooth and nail against the House Judiciary's bill and trying to push the Intelligence Committee's bill. And I just think it's, like Michael Lee said, it's a very obvious Trojan horse. The other thing I forgot to note, the good bill that's coming from the Judiciary Committee, it also would close a loophole that currently allows the government to circumvent a ban on buying private data directly from companies and instead using third-party brokers to buy the same data from an indirect source. So it's not getting rid of it. I personally think we probably should get rid of it. I don't really think that it's actually needed. I was racking my brain about this. I mean, what would prohibit them from spying on non-American citizens overseas in the first place? Like, they're not protected by the Constitution in the same way you or I would be. And so it doesn't seem that this is actually even necessary to do what they say they use it for. And I think that regardless, the basic civil rights that are protected by the Constitution trump everything else. They trump everything else. They trump security even, because ultimately, what is security if you don't have freedom? It doesn't matter. So I really do think that this is just a complete hogwash. I don't like the people who are disingenuously propping up the Intelligence Committee's bill. I think they're doing the typical thing and relying on a lot of fear mongering. And it's interesting how their rhetoric and their talking points haven't progressed at all since 9/11. I was watching Mike Turner, who's one of the sponsors on the bad bill, and he was saying, we have to have this to stop the terrorists. And basically, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. And it's like, I mean, guys, like this no longer works on people, right? You are so far removed from the culture of where we were when you first got these things through in 2001 or even 2007, 8 around FISA when FISA was passed, but they're still stuck in that timeline and they don't recognize that those fear mongering talking points fall flat now. They didn't track. We know what you're actually using this for. Americans aren't stupid. They're figuring it out. So keep a close eye on this. I've tweeted several ways that you can raise your voice on the issue if you want to take action on that. I think that I will definitely be doing so, even though it did get punted for a little bit later on, but I still think it is something to keep your eye on.